and welcome to another special edition of Inside Look. Today, I'm joined by author and illustrator Lisa Graves, who's also a Bishop Fee alumnus and a resident of North Attleboro. Lisa, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great. I'm excited about this.
We'll get to the book that you just released, Simple Stories of Strong Women from A to Z. But first, I want to talk about what initially got you into writing and into illustration.
Well, I worked in New York City for a long time as a creative director, and I was developing products for stores like Target and Walmart and Home Depot. And I enjoyed the illustration aspect of it. So I went further into the illustration and developed a blog called History Witch. And I profiled different women in history, wrote a short bio, painted their portrait, and it took off. I have like 15,000 followers, and the publishers found me that way, and they asked me to do some books, and it just went from there.
So what initially kind of got you, or what initially got you into illustration? Was it something that you did in high school and through college, or was it something that you sort of picked up as a hobby that turned into a career?
It was a very unconventional path to that world. I took a job as a secretary at an ad agency, and within 4 months, I was promoted to senior art director because I just had that design knack, and I never really explored it until I moved to California, and I went to San Diego Advertising Arts College, and that's kind of where it started. Somebody gave me a chance.
So let's take a step back here. And so obviously you go to Bishop Fee, and what did you do post-graduation? Where did you go to school? And then was that job that you just mentioned your first job out of college?
No, again, a very unconventional path. I went to North Carolina State for a little while, wasn't loving it, came home, worked, and then moved to California, and that's kind of where my creativity started to kick in, and that's when I got that job. So a lot of different jobs in between. I've done everything.
Was there a moment that you remember that really sparked your creativity, or was it something that you always liked doing creative things and it was just kind of right place, right time when you were out in California?
That aha moment came a little bit later. I had a publisher contact me, and I was living here in Massachusetts. This was later. And I was taken down the Acela train down to New York to meet with that publisher. And I just had this idea for a few different books. And when I got to New York, by the time the train arrived, I had a gazillion sketches, handwritten notes, ideas, and I just threw everything at her. And she's like, all right, let's do this. So that's where the history book started coming into play.
So I would assume working in New York, working in Manhattan, in the creative fields is equal parts energizing and exciting and really keeps the creative spark alive, but also is pretty challenging. What is it like working in that environment?
Well, it's highly competitive, and you have to be very thick-skinned. You have to be very open to harsh opinions and critiques and rejection and all of those things that sound horrible but actually make you a better creative. They make you much better at your field. All that. I always had thick-skinned. I grew up with 3 brothers who are merciless. Yeah. And they kind of toughened me up, I suppose, for that New York creative atmosphere. It is very exciting. I do miss it sometimes, but it's nice to be in a little bit of a calmer place.
Was there a moment or a meeting with somebody that stands out as kind of your first introduction moment of, okay, this is a cutthroat, tough environment that kind of sticks out to you? And was a moment maybe that was, all right, this is what I have to kind of prepare myself for?
Very much so, yeah. It was a very specific meeting that almost threw me off the edge with it was a retail client. I won't name names, a very big retail client. And the person in charge making decisions was questioning my age, my gender, my creativity. I had all these beautiful boards presentation for her, and it was just eaten alive. And I left there like, oh, this is awful. But it actually turned it around, and the next presentation went really well because I kind of read into what she was feeding me instead of turning it into a personal attack. I knew business is business, and you gotta dress to impress.
So you mentioned gender in there, and that seems to be one of the big focuses of a lot of your work. Why is highlighting stories of inspiring and powerful women something that you kind of lean towards or focus on doing?
Well, when I started that History Witch blog and I was profiling all these women in history, it's kind of common knowledge that men wrote most of our history. So I was finding out different accounts for all these women that portrayed them in a better light. So I kept diving further and further, and it just snowballed. And I wanted to empower these young girls to really do their research and look into the history, that some of these stories aren't entirely true when they paint these women in a negative light. So I kind of started figuring this out. Like, a lot of it started with women that were accused of witchcraft in history. It basically equates to what we consider bullying now. Like, if back in 16, 1700s, if you didn't like somebody, you could accuse them of being a witch. It's kind of what happens in today's day and age with social media. Somebody can write one bad thing about you, and it turns into something completely different and not true. So I wanted to paint a positive light on these women and showcase that they overcome such adversity, and that it can be relatable to today's world.
How much of a challenge is it to kind of uncover the true stories of these women? As you mentioned, a lot of the history books are written from the opposite perspective. How hard is it to kind of dig down and find the truth about them?
It is difficult. You have to read between the lines, and you have to say, well, this is just an opinion, this passage or this chapter. It's an opinion somebody had. So going back and researching the facts and trying to look into, okay, why did she make this decision? Why was she accused of witchcraft? Oh, because somebody wanted her property, or somebody didn't like her, the way she dressed. Or you kind of have to read between the lines and kind of form your own opinion based on what facts are available.
Who are some of the women that you've done work on that maybe a little underrepresented, who you think have some really interesting stories that not only young women, but everybody should kind of dig their teeth into?
Well, there's a lot. One of my books is called Trailblazers, and it's a book on female explorers. And personally, I had never heard of about 80% of the people in the women in that book. Um, Nellie Bly is an example of, people somewhat know her, but they don't know the whole story of Nellie Bly. And she's in this new book. She's also in the Trailblazers Female Explorer book. She was just so inspiring, the way women were expected to write about gardening and fashion back in her time. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that. And she went undercover at a mental hospital and exposed the harsh realities of the treatment of the patients there. So she kind of took it in her own, right, and said, no, you're not going to tell me what to do. And she became an extraordinary journalist, as going down in history as one of our best. So women like her really empower me, and I hope to expose women like her to young girls to say, your obstacles aren't that bad. You can overcome them.
Not only does it seem like illustration and writing is something you're interested in, it seems like history also seems to be something you're interested in. What drives you towards that so much?
Well, it started a while ago. Friends of mine started a blog and webpage called They Draw and Travel. So artists from all over the world contribute maps that they've illustrated. And they asked me to contribute a map to that. And I started researching. For some reason, I can't even tell you why, Mary Queen of Scots came to mind. And I wanted to know about where she was imprisoned throughout the world. She was moved around the UK quite a bit by her cousin Elizabeth. And I started illustrating that map of her journey. And it just sparked this history. Like, okay, I want to know more about Marie Antoinette. I want to know more about Elizabeth I. I want to know about King Henry's wives. I just started, it got me excited and motivated me to do all of this.
And what do you think is so important about, so I know everybody has their own kind of philosophy on why studying history is important. Why is it important to you?
I come from a slant where I want to make history kind of exciting for kids. It's always considered the boring subject, but there's so many interesting, fascinating stories out there. Just people did these crazy things that today you would be like, it would be a headline, and it just didn't do that back then. So I like to make it more exciting and more interesting to get people more excited to do the research and find out the truth.
We're obviously living in a pretty interesting time currently where I'm sure that you're seeing some parallels between some of the struggles and some of the trials and tribulation that women in prominent positions are going through. What are some of the things that you see that are happening now that are reminiscent to some of the stories of these women of the past who you've kind of uncovered?
Great question. I see it quite a bit. For instance, if we go to Henry VIII's wives, there was so much competition and cutthroat. Women just didn't support other women. And I think we have a lot of that now. Women are, a lot of the women in politics, they're so cutthroat and they're attacking each other. We need more of that, women supporting women. And it goes back to throughout history. We've always done that to each other. So hopefully we can get around that at some point. But yeah, today there's a lot of that.
So I'm sure you had to walk a pretty fine line between trying to distill some complex stories and complex history down into something that a child could kind of, one, be interested in and understand and then be inspired by. How big of a challenge was it to kind of start to put this book together in a way that would hit your target audience?
Well, the new book, I've given, it's not a very detailed account of their lives. It's a very skimmed over short bio about each woman, so that I feel like when it's short like that, it's easier to retain the information and maybe inspire you to do a little bit more research, because that's how I went about it. I saw something on Mary Queen of Scots and I just wanted to know more. So I'm hoping with this book that happens, that people want to do further research on, like maybe one of these quick stories hits home for a young girl. And then she was like, oh, I want to know more about this. So hopefully that inspires them to do research, to write, to illustrate, pull all those ideas together.
So talking about this book, 26 women featured in this, obviously A to Z, so each one represents one of the letters of the alphabet. Let's talk about the process of narrowing it down to that final 26. How many names did you originally have that you were throwing around? How hard was it to finally come down to, these are the 26 that I'm going to put in here?
Well, that was very challenging. I have scribbles and notebooks and everything about who I wanted to do. And unfortunately, like, I would have loved to have included Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Gloria Steinem or somebody like that. But there's all sorts of permissions and rights that you have to overcome to include those. And unfortunately, when I did do this book, it was before Ruth had passed. So it was difficult to narrow it down. Some of these letters I had 1 million for, but X and Z were a little hard.
Yeah, I can only imagine that those are not exactly full of names to pull from. And
it took a lot of research.
Yeah. So how did you make when you had a letter that you might have had 3 or 4 very worthy candidates, how did you make that final decision on which one was going to actually make the book?
It came down to inclusivity and diversity, really. I wanted to represent women from all over the world, all different classes, all different backgrounds, different professions. So it was just about having that diversity of different women. So some of them there was a few teachers and things like that. So I didn't want to be too repetitive. I wanted to get as many different women in there as I could. So that's really what determined who got chosen for the book.
Now, I skimmed through the book a couple days ago, and there were a couple names that I saw that obviously I think are pretty popular, that obviously ring a bell when I looked through them. But there were some that I'd never heard of, and I'm sure that there's a fair few that a lot of people haven't heard of. Who are some of your favorites in there that are ones that you're hoping to kind of bring to the forefront a little more?
Well, I think that everybody knows about Frida Kahlo, but like somebody like Harriet Jacobs. She was a slave and she hid in an attic for 7 years and then came out and became an activist and was very positive later after she escaped this horrible fate. So someone like her, I think, would be great for girls to look into and see, if she can do that, I can overcome this, chemistry test or something silly. It puts everything in perspective. Someone like her. Wilma Rudolph, she had polio as a child and then became a track star. So women like that, I just find so incredibly inspiring and just makes me want to do more with my career, my life, everything. So I'm hoping women like that inspire the girls.
Now, going back to the actual creative process a little bit, are you researching the women first and building the bio and the written section out and then working on the illustration, or are you doing the illustration first, or is it just a jumble of them sketching a little here, doing a little research there, and it all comes together at the end?
I kind of have a process because I've done 21 books now. And what I do is I start with a map, and it's a blank sheet with squares for pages. And I start scribbling what I want where. And then I slowly develop the manuscript and write with little thumbnail sketches on each one page of that map. So that's how it all begins. And then I dive into the painting. And then the writing is actually my least favorite. So I do that afterwards. But I have a general idea of the amount of space I have to write, the amount of paragraphs I should have, a rough idea of the target audience and how to structure those sentences based on that audience.
And now when you're doing the illustrations, it does look like it's what is that? Are you doing watercolor art there? Or is there a combination of digital to that? What's that process like?
It's definitely watercolor, pencil, ink, digital. I'd sometimes even use salt in my paintings. It creates a different background. I overlap ink and pencil together with the watercolors and use some different effects to juice up the vibrancy of those paintings for the books.
So I think obviously the paintings and the illustration are important because that's kind of the gateway, I think, for your target audience to kind of wrap their arms around these characters. So the actual picture is so important in encapsulating that person and what they're all about. I feel like it has to be pretty important. How much of a challenge is it to make those portraits, to put those together and encapsulate who these people are?
It is a bit challenging. Like some of the women just come right out. Like I'll sketch it. The first sketch is what I'm going to paint. And others, I'm like, that's not quite right. I have to go back, redraw, that kind of thing. So like the very first, it was a rough sketch on a notepad while I was watching TV of Florence Nightingale. And I was like, I think I should do something with that. So that kind of inspired the whole idea for this book. Like this rough sketch, it was a little different from my normal style. And I'm like, I think I want to do something with this. And that's how it evolved into this A to Z women, because I was going to include Florence Nightingale because of that one rough sketch. So yeah, some of them come off very easily. I have such an excitement to draw them. And others I'm like, ooh, this is a challenge. So yeah, it's some of them are easy, some of them are harder.
Do you have any off the top of your head? One that was maybe really easy, it just kind of came right out, was a simple one start to finish, and an example of maybe one that took a couple go-arounds, a couple revisions to finally get it to where you wanted?
Yeah, well, Nellie Bly has always been one of my favorite women in history. So she was like easy, instant sketch to painting right away. I think it took me maximum 3 hours to finish from start to finish to do her portrait. But Princess Zhu, the ex in the book, I had to do a little more research on what she would be wearing, what colors. There's no visual history of her. There's just depictions, that were done later, hundreds of years later. So it was a little more difficult and challenging to research her and what she would look like and what she would be wearing.
So from start to finish, how long did this book take for you to put together and be ready to be published?
I would say about 8 months. I tend to work fairly quickly. That's actually a very short timeline for a history book. But I wanted to get this out, and it was such a, I just threw the idea at the publisher, like, hey, I want to do this. And she's like, yeah, let's do it. Go for it. And I just took off running, and it just kept cranking out in my little art studio. So it was quick.
Now, I'm assuming even in regular times, there's a lot of remote contact with the publisher and things of that nature. Did obviously the COVID-19 situation affect your production schedule at all, or is that just something where, because you're used to working remotely, it didn't really make that much of a difference?
It only made a difference in the printing. It's a little more difficult to get the printing, shipping, that kind of thing. But other than that, it really didn't make any difference because I work with 3 publishers in the UK, in California, and in New York. So I rarely meet with them. Those 2 publishers I've never met. So it really didn't affect me in the process for this book. I think it will on the next.
So I think this is probably as good a time as ever to just kind of, if there's anybody interested in picking up a copy of the book, where can they get it? and what's kind of the target audience that you're hoping to get this book in the hands of?
It's definitely targeted towards like the 6 to 12-year-old range. And anybody can order it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Yeah, mostly online. I'm not sure if it's getting to the stores just yet, but I don't think people are going in the stores right now. So it works out that they can get it on ebook, or they can get the hardcover or softcover right on Amazon.
Awesome. That's fantastic. So obviously with this book done and published, it was published in mid-October. What are your future plans, or do you have anything in mind right now, or is it just a period where you're kind of kicking around a bunch of ideas and a bunch of sketches to kind of go on from there?
Well, I do have another book that I did not write that I'm just illustrating, and it's a medieval joke book for young boys. So that's coming slowly. A lot of fun little jokes. And then I have another self-imposed project for a book idea about a little girl that explores different career avenues of, with the idea that she can do anything, she can be anything when she gets older. So it kind of explores her attempts at trying different things, from singing to farming to fishing. So that's something that I'm really excited about and is motivating me. And hopefully next year we get that going and out in the world.
Is it harder or easier to illustrate for writing that you didn't do? You mentioned you're illustrating for the joke book, and obviously this book you wrote and illustrated for. What are the differences? Is one easier than the other?
I think it's easier to illustrate a book for somebody else. It's harder when you write it and illustrate it, just because you're pouring so much of yourself into that. And then it's sent out in the world and it's judged and critiqued. And so it's a lot more personal when you do both. And it can be harsh, really harsh. I had a book, it's actually a historical cookbook, come out a few years ago. And people were brutal online. It was like hard to take, but you just got to keep going and know that a lot of people are going to have something to say. So when you pour all of yourself with the writing and the illustrating and the research and all of that, I even set the type and design the covers for my book. So when you do that much and pour that much into it, it can be a little hard.
And that brings up an interesting question. How much time do you spend online looking at what people have to say about your work, or now do you try to stay away from it? Because on a smaller scale, we're putting out content, and then sometimes like you said, you pour a lot into it, and you kind of peak and you hope that the responses are what you're looking for, but it can certainly be disheartening when it goes the other way. So how much time do you spend looking at that stuff, or is it something that you've kind of grown to say it might not be worth, spending the time to look at it?
My first 3 or 4 books, I was all over it and heartbroken half the time. But now I rarely look. Like every once in a while, I'll check Goodreads, or look at some of the comments on Amazon. I just take it with a grain of salt now, because I just keep going and doing what I'm doing, and a lot of people enjoy it and get something from it. So if one person is affected by, one little girl is inspired by someone in one of my books, I've done my job, and I'm okay with that.
Have you had any interactions, maybe at a book signing or something like that, where you have had somebody come up to you and say, I read your work, I really loved it, and it's inspired me to kind of to be a better person, or whatever they may have said?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I did. I used to do some school lectures. I go into local schools and libraries and talk about a current book or talk about art and illustration. And I just kept, this one little boy just kept coming up to me and saying, I just love your work. I want to do what you do. And he just kept, he looked emotional, like he was going to cry or something. And I was just so taken aback that, a boy, most of my books are girl books. So he was really inspired to write and be creative. And his teacher told me later on that was the direction he was going. And one kind word from me definitely inspired him to keep going. So that definitely is the most rewarding part of this.
That must feel fantastic. I can only
It does.
imagine what that's like. So when we were setting up this interview, I kind of gave you a little bit of homework. I asked you to pull out a passage of the book that was close to you or important to you, to kind of give us a little preview. So if you could just kind of set up the passage that you ended up choosing, and then giving us the little sneak preview.
Sure. So I definitely chose Nellie Bly. I mentioned she is my favorite. So I'll just go ahead and read this, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about her, because it's just so fascinating, her story. Here's the cover there. Nellie grew up in Pennsylvania and knew from a very young age that she wanted to become a newspaper reporter. She went undercover at a hospital and wrote a famous article that ultimately improved the horrible conditions for the patients there. She also traveled around the world in 72 days. This was thought to be impossible during those times, especially for a young lady. Nellie proved everyone wrong and is remembered as an extraordinary journalist. So as you can see, that's like a small snippet into this world of Nellie Bly. But she, someone told her that she couldn't go around the world in 80 days, and she did it in 72. And in that time, we didn't have cell phones or even phones or credit cards or anything. And she had gold and money tied around her neck. She had an overcoat. She only carried a small bag for toiletries and managed to get all the way around the world in 72 days. So I've always been impressed with her. And the undercover work at the hospital, she got in there, and I mean, the audacity of it all and the bravery of it all. I mean, there could be a chance that she wouldn't have made it out of that mental hospital. And she wrote this amazing article in a time, like I said, when women were expected to just write about gardening and fashion. So, like it's women like her throughout this new book that I hope young girls will realize that they can overcome any challenge.
And I think hearing that excerpt right there, as you said earlier, that is a perfect little entryway into this. Gives you a little taste of what this person was all about. And then there's this whole deeper story that you can go out and look and research. And that was one of 26 women featured in the book. So if you're listening, you're watching, there's 25 more short stories that you can read and then look into. And again, you can get that. It's Simple Stories of Strong Women, an A to Z guide to girl power. You can find it on Amazon. Lisa, thank you for taking the time. Keep up the good work, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, you can grab this on Amazon. Hopefully you can see that. I'm kind of zoomed out, but there's the cover. Thank you, Lisa. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.